Hi, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here in the virtual realm at We Make Tomorrow 2022. My name is Thanki, and I've been active in the global climate justice movement for many years now, working with the global campaign to demand climate justice, the COP26 coalition, Young Road, the youth constituency at the COP, and in many other constellations. I'm recording this Ignite Idea talk from Ibagué, Colombia, where I live. And for anybody who maybe has visual impairments, just a brief description: I have a beard, I'm wearing a black hat and a navy t-shirt. And today I'm going to tell you about why I'm now fighting for a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty and how you can too. So for an audience like this, I don't think I'm going to lose a lot of time reminding you about the severity of the climate crisis or about how it fans the flames of really every existing injustice. And I don't think that the latest science from the IPCC about climate impacts and their severity is going to be new to you. And nor do I really think that you need to be reminded how the main cause of the climate emergency is the burning of fossil fuels. But what I might start with is just a word on the scale. So we know that coal, oil, and gas are responsible for almost 80% of all carbon dioxide emissions since the Industrial Revolution. And according to the United Nations Environment Programme's production gap report, the fossil fuel industry is planning to produce around 120% more of fossil fuels than would be consistent with keeping temperatures below 1.5. So their report also shows that we actually need to be reducing globally 6% per year. And also they've emphasized the need for international cooperation in winding down fossil fuel production and fast tracking progress towards a renewable energy transition. So all of this just makes climate change the greatest risk facing the world, because risk is likelihood times impact. And so, this is not a threat that can really be nullified with a simple switch of fuel sources. What we're actually witnessing in reality, in terms of renewable energy, is not a switch from fossil capacity to renewable capacity. We're just adding renewable capacity on top of fossil fuels. And so you would think that, given the scale of the threat, that the international legal instrument of note when it comes to climate change, the Paris Agreement, would at least mention fossil fuels. It doesn't. So we're in a situation of needing really concentrated international cooperation to address the managed decline of fossil fuels, and the Paris Agreement is not providing it. So there really is a need for international coordination on the question of fossil fuels, given the scale of the challenge, the urgency, and crucially, the fact that many countries face capacity constraints, which means they can't actually undertake the energy transition on their own. So while all fossil fuel producing countries face major challenges when it comes to their transition, if you look at countries like the US, Canada, the UK, which on this chart are over towards the left, you can see that they actually have quite diversified economies, which means that they're not dependent on oil or gas revenues for their taxation and therefore for the provision of government services. What you'll also notice is that they have a higher GDP per capita, which is an indication of a greater capacity to transition away from fossil fuels. Now, by contrast, we've got countries like over to the right and to the bottom of this chart, like Iraq, Azerbaijan, Congo, Timor-Leste, that are far more dependent on fossil fuels for generating revenue and have a much lower capacity to fund their transition. So there really is a need for support and for an international agreement around which countries can phase out fossil fuels based on principles of equity and capacity and so on. So without this international cooperation and the required global governance to phase out fossil fuels, what happens? You're already seeing what happens when we notice that there is more difficulty in making the transition. There are the creation of stranded assets, risk of financial turmoil. It creates risks to fossil fuel workers and their communities. It delays the renewable energy expansion. It delays the economic diversification. It really consolidates power in the fossil fuel interests. And it also, unfortunately, increases the likelihood that we're going to rely on dangerous false solutions such as geoengineering and carbon markets to try and get our way out of the problem rather than actually directly addressing it. So this is where the idea of a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty really comes in. Now, the language of non-proliferation is really useful for two reasons. One, because we're trying to develop a framing of fossil fuels as being an equivalent threat or even greater threat than weapons of mass destruction, but also because the pillars of the existing non-proliferation of nuclear arms really map quite well onto the situation around fossil fuels. We need a non-proliferation, so that's the end of expansion. We need disarmament, which in the fossil fuel case would be a phase down and phase out of fossil fuels, and then we need a peaceful transition. So unfortunately, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty itself hasn't been as successful as was hoped, and we also have to look at other examples, such as the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons and an emerging plastics treaty, in order to build our campaigns and diplomatic strategy. However, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty is a great example of a legal regime where a massive coordinated civil society movement and a majority of non-nuclear armed states ended up having a huge impact in changing the narrative of nuclear weapons and enforcing limits on the nuclear armed states by prohibiting production, manufacturing, acquiring, possessing, or stockpiling of nuclear weapons. So we hope that the same approach can work with fossil fuels in the shape of a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. The details of the treaty, the provisions, the text, that's up for countries to negotiate, but the framework of non-proliferation actually gives us some guiding principles, which are like pillars of the idea, which again, non-proliferation, so preventing new exploration and production, global disarmament, so the phase out of existing production, and the peaceful transition, so really fast tracking real solutions to increase access to renewable energy and ensuring a just transition. Now, unfortunately, the dominant approach of climate action focuses on restricting greenhouse gas emissions and the demand for fossil fuels without really having a focus on the production. What this does, like failing to manage the phase out of fossil fuel, means that the climate goals won't be met, but it also endangers, as I said, workers and vulnerable communities who are dependent on production for their livelihoods, and risk facing a sudden loss of income when the projects become unviable, essentially. So against all of this backdrop, the treaty initiative's mission is to create a globally coordinated plan for the just transition away from fossil fuels. So one that is feasible, fair, and also aligned with the Paris Agreement's goal of limiting warming below 1.5. Now, we think that we have a number of objectives to help us do this. We want to change the norms of fossil fuel production by demonstrating that there's action on fossil fuel supply. We want to provide a missing legal framework and mechanism for multilateralism to address this. We want to grow the global movement for a just energy transition. We think that by motivating cities and states to endorse and call for a treaty, that's one important way. We also think that increasing transparency and accountability by developing research on the expansion is another way. And of course, we are always up for complementing frontline campaigns with a unifying political demand, which is what we think is lacking in this work. So we believe that by building a directed network campaign, which centers on movement building, on narrative shifting, on raising specific yet ambitious demands, supported by an evidence base, and of course, complementing other strategies, that we will see an increased opposition to fossil fuel expansion, and we will see a rapid scaling up of municipalities and individuals endorsing a fossil fuel treaty, all leading to a growing international support for the legal arrangement. While I believe that the most significant work that we do is around that movement building, the contribution to a global movement, we're also actually undertaking the diplomatic and political outreach directly with country governments to bring the issue of fossil fuel production right into the heart of multilateralism and foreign policy debates and create pressure for action. We're starting to see a lot of momentum around this idea. We have lots and lots of different civil society organizations from all kinds of constituencies, youth, faith, health, indigenous, as well as high profile individuals, scientists, academic researchers, parliamentarians, Nobel laureates. And we've seen a lot of cities and subnationals already endorsing. We've got recently London, Paris, Lima, Hawaii. And in addition to all of this, we're moving closer to the point of having a first mover club of countries championing the idea at the international stage. And also, because let a million flowers bloom, we're seeing countries like Colombia independently championing the pillars of the fossil fuel treaty without calling it the fossil fuel treaty. We're seeing breakthroughs in the multilateral space, small but significant. At COP26 in Glasgow, countries agreed to a general language around phase down of coal and of subsidies. And then building on that in Stockholm, at Stockholm Plus 50, there was a recommendation for the phase out of all fossil fuels and the recognition of financial and technical support for a just transition. So this is not the only strategy or big idea that we have in the climate movement. We understand that others in the movement mightn't fully align with this theory of change, but what we believe is that the climate movement has to take a pluralistic approach to ending fossil fuels. What the treaty initiative is a network campaign. It's not an idea that any individual or organization owns. So if you also see the need for international cooperation to phase out fossil fuels, then get involved. You can endorse the treaty idea yourself, run your own campaigns to get your city to endorse it and to pass bills, legislation that would build towards it. Collaborate with the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Network around major moments. Coming up, we've got the G20, we've got COP27, we've got the UN General Assembly in New York, whatever best aligns with you. So to take the first step, just visit our website. You can find us on all the social media. And of course, we're always open to discuss the idea further with champions and with potential partners. So I'd really just like to thank you for listening. Thank you for your time. I hope to hear from you soon.